Welcome everybody to the I Believe in All Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. We have a famous presenter today.
As opposed to the infamous people that we
normal infamous people. We also have an event going on today all day on civil liberties and national security. If you're interested in that after this, really very similar issues. How to create a sitcom about Muslims very carefully with Zarqa Nawaz originally from Toronto, but more recently from Saskatchewan, which apparently has a very interesting history of Muslim migration there, as we were just discussing. She created the world's first sitcom about a Muslim community living in the West. You may have heard of it a couple years ago. Little Mosque on the Prairie premiered to record ratings on the CBC in 2007. The show demystified Islam for millions of people around the world by explaining how practicing Muslims live their lives from dating to marriage to burying their dead. And now she has written her best-selling comedic memoir, Laughing All the Way to the Mosque. I haven't read it, but my wife's friends love it. My wife hasn't read it either yet, but we're both going to read it.
I'm happy to know that you announced that.
Yeah, well, she's busy. She reads news stuff. So this has been very well received by lots of readers. About growing up as a Canadian of Muslim faith, she was not beaten or stoned. Maybe there was an error here. She was not beaten or stoned. So alas, she may be the most boring Muslim on the planet, but her stories about Muslims going to summer camp are pretty funny. I hated summer camp. And the book is on sale outside, and I can only assume she'll sign copies, because otherwise, what's the point of her being here? So you can get it outside, and we'll be selling them afterwards, and it looks like it's not too expensive, is my guess. So we'll go until around, we can go till about 1:30, so it gives us about an hour for presentation and question and answer. So please, without further ado, commence. Looks like we have a great presentation.
Thank you. So there's no, can you guys hear me? Because there's no, and they want me to talk here so that they can capture my voice, but it's not actually going to make me louder. So I wanted to thank George, how do you say the name of the university?
Georgetown.
Yeah, I want to say George
Just
Brown.
George
because
Washington. You don't get it
George
GW, you call it Georgetown.
we have a George Brown in Canada, so I call it, and I do call it George Washington. And my husband's like, you got to get this straight when you go to the U.S., or we're going to make us look very provincial. So I wanted to thank Jack for letting me come here today and talk. This is always so exciting for me to come to the U.S. I mean, I live in Saskatchewan, which is above North Dakota, and our entire population of the province is 1 million people. So when I come, that must be the population of just this university, right, alone. This is like a little mini city-state whenever I go to universities in the U.S. So I'm always excited. Like I go to Whole Foods. Have you heard of Whole Foods? Yeah, and I get like stuck in the deodorant aisle, and I'll be like standing there staring at all the different, and then buy the wrong thing in the end. Not even buy the deodorant. There's some spray thing, and I'm like, now I have to go back to another place, maybe a CVS, and get a deodorant. But anyway, I should mention those type of problems while I'm standing here. So I have a presentation about what it took to create a television show like Little Mosque on the Prairie. And my journey, let's see where my journey begins. These are my parents. So my father was 15 years old when he lived in Ludhiana, India, when the British decided to create Pakistan and India, and it was a partition. And so he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And, they had lived for centuries with their neighbors, Sikhs and Hindus and Muslims, in relative peace. And then overnight, as all of you probably know, everything changed dramatically. Neighbors started killing each other. They had to leave everything, houses, money, finances, land, and just go to refugee camps and stay there until they were loaded onto trains and then transported to what is now Pakistan. And it was a really, really, really traumatic experience for my father because he was 15 years old, and what he learned in that instant is that everything can be taken away from you, like everything in a heartbeat, that you cannot take anything for granted, that everything that you had growing up, all your financial security, your family, can all disappear in an instant. And so he became really obsessed with education. obsessed with education, and he felt as the eldest, and in the culture he comes from, it's the eldest son that is responsible for taking care of the family financially after the parents. And so he felt that now he had to, help raise, I can never remember how many brothers and sisters he has, like this huge family, and get them out of indentured poverty very quickly, because that's where they were headed very, very rapidly. And so he got scholarships. He was really smart and intelligent. He got scholarships in engineering, and he became a civil engineer. And at that time, England was looking for civil engineers to help rebuild after World War II. And particularly a city called Liverpool in England was looking for engineers to help build the Mersey tunnels. Does anyone here know what a Mersey tunnel is in England? No, I don't actually know either, but that's the reason that he was sent to Liverpool, was to be one of the civil engineers working on the Mersey tunnels. So he was working as an engineer. I'll just wait till everyone gets a chance to sit. Mersey. It's actually Mersey. Mersey. I keep calling it Mercy, but it's Mersey, right? Mersey. So he was helping build the Mersey tunnels, which was a very large undertaking in Liverpool. And by this time, he was in his 30s, right? And so the villagers back home in Faisalabad, where he had settled, were starting to say to his parents, when is he ever going to get married? And they were like, well, he won't come home. He refuses to come home to get married because he feels he has to spend the rest of his life now working and sending money home to help, his brothers and sisters get educated and get married. And so they started making fun of the family, and they started saying, well, you're treating him like a cash cow. Like, this isn't fair. He deserves a life and a future. And so, as was typical at that time, they sent a telegraph home to him and said his father was dying and he had to rush back. So he rushed back home, and it turned out that they had arranged his marriage, and he was getting married to my mom, and he didn't really realize he was getting married, but that's how old school arranged marriages worked back then. It was like, this is it, you're getting married, here's your bride. And this is their photograph that they took shortly after they got married. Actually, I think they took this in Liverpool, England. They came back together. I guess in that time period, family reunification was very quick, because you could literally get married in Pakistan, bring your bride over the next day. And so his friends were like, so how is your dad? And he's like, he's fine apparently, but here's my new bride, right? And so this is their wedding picture of them as a young married couple in England starting their lives. And so a year later, I was born. Aren't they cute, you guys? My mom used to knit all my hats and things. It was all hand knitted. So there I am. And so I'm the eldest of three children. So I'm born a year after they got married, and then I have two younger brothers. And so for my father, he was obsessed with education, as I mentioned, because of what he had gone through before. And typically, what immigrant fathers want for their daughters is medical school, right? This is the number one profession that fathers want for their daughters. It's just like to the point of brainwashing, right? They will brainwash you from the moment that you're born, to make sure there's no other career path that you could possibly envision, because they feel that you'll make good money, you'll have respect in society. And in my father, a very strange thing happened, because his younger sisters had gotten married as teenagers, and he had seen all these women in his family get married very young. He has this philosophy. It was, even though he's a very, very conservative Pakistani father, it was like growing up with a prototype Gloria Steinem, because what he would say to me is like, if a woman is educated and makes a lot of money, she'll never need to get married, because marriage is for those women who fail in life, right? Because that was his attitude towards men and marriage. It was the reason that women couldn't go on to higher education. Every single time we would have someone visit us, if she had a BSc, he would say, if she hadn't married him, she could have got her master's. And if someone came with a master's, if she hadn't married that fool, she could have had a PhD. And it was like on and on. Even if she was a medical doctor, if she hadn't married him, she could have been a surgeon. She could have been the head of the department. It was like manic. He would go on and on. Like, he would go on, but how men essentially in marriage destroy women's lives, right? So you're growing up now with this incredible, anti-man, anti-marriage sentiment. And of course, my mother, she's having to keep quiet because she was very insulted, as you can imagine. She did not consider her marriage to my dad as a failure in her life, right? And so growing up with this attitude, and what it was like, having to constantly live up to your parents' expectations and go to medical school. I actually did really well in high school. And then I went to university. And that's where it started to get a little dicey for me, because what I realized was that I didn't really have that passion that you needed to keep organic chemistry and physics and, all the really hard sciences. Like, you had to maintain your marks, right? At least 90s, because in Canada we have entrance boards that weed out people like me who really no longer have a desire to keep high grades up and wanting to go into medical school anymore. But I had to finish my BSc because once you start, you want to finish, and your father's waiting. And so I did not, when the rejection came in for medical school, it was like the most devastating experience in my life, because that was the only goal I had in my adult life up to that point. Like, I only had one goal, that was to become a doctor. And when it didn't happen, it was like, I literally felt there was no more future. There was nothing on the horizon, that I would just wind up in a factory making widgets. Like, there's nothing. I'm only like 22. But my mother, who had been waiting for this opportunity, was like, I have a plan B. We'll get you married, right? So next thing I know, and there seems to be this unending stream of young men who are doing their PhDs in American universities who just need citizenship with benefits, right? There seems to be an unending parade of them. So my aunts, got together, and suddenly there were, and I used to name them according to their state, like Atlanta, Nebraska, Florida. So one would show up every week in the living room, Natalie dressed, and I would be expected to go in with a tray of tea and samosas and entertain him. And I was like, oh my God. And of course, all of these guys had contracts where they'd have to get their PhD in the US and then go back to the University of Karachi or something and, do their 2 or 3 years. And so I realized really quickly I was going to wind up as a housewife in Karachi if I didn't figure out my life rapidly. And so I thought, what am I going to do? Like, I have never had another goal other than science and medicine. And my best friend at that time was always talking about writing books and writing novels and writing films. But the arts were like the sexy realm of things that good Muslim women did not do, right? And so I thought, how does someone like me, who's never had any like experience in the arts, get into a program like journalism? And so luckily for me, Ryerson Journalism School, which is one of the most prestigious journalism schools in Canada, was still accepting applications after medical school rejected me. So I quickly applied, and I actually got an interview. And so there's an elderly man who invited me in, and he's like, you are the most unique applicant we've ever had. Every single person that has applied to this program has a BA, and here you are as a single applicant with a BSc. He goes, why did you do that? And I said, my whole life, all I've ever wanted to be is a journalist. And he's like, really? And I said, yeah. And I figured the only way I would stand out at a prestigious school like Ryerson, when you have all these eminently qualified people, was to get a different degree than everyone else, because I now can bring to your school what no one else can. And then he was like, can you give me an example of what you could bring? And of course that was useless, right? Because what example would these things that they taught you in science, like these rotating balls and discovering the internal circumference, like useless knowledge, right? But luckily I had been leafing nervously through a female, those women's magazines in the waiting area. And I said to him, there has been a new discovery that they taught us in physics class, and it's called Norplant. And you inject it in a woman's arm, and it gives out hormones, birth control hormones, that will release women from having to take the pill every day. This was revolutionary, right, in the 1980s. And clearly his wife was in menopause. He had never heard of any of this stuff, so he was so amazed, right? He was like, "Wow, we need to get this out into every women's magazine out there. Like people like you. This is why we need people like you at our school, because we don't know about these things." And I was like, "No, you don't, right?" And so he let me in based on nothing, right? Because I had nothing, not a resume. I had like nothing. And, I felt bad that all these people had been working for years writing in magazines and newspapers and clippings. And then that's when I realized, oh my God, I can tell story. I have this ability to tell story and to make things up, right? Out of whole cloth. I mean, this is where I belong. So I got into journalism school, and I started doing really, really well. And my grades started going up, and I was thriving in the school. And I actually won the award for the best radio documentary in Canada. I don't know if you guys know, because this is the United States. Have you heard of a show called Morningside in Canada with Peter Zosky? Have you heard of that show? Yes, it was the most famous show in Canada at the time. And the person who won the radio documentary in Stuart McLean's class got an internship. So I won, right? So I won. So I'm at the award ceremony for all the journalism schools in Ontario. And they want me to take a picture with my instructor, Stuart McLean. And so they're about to take a picture, and I feel this, like, not, on my shoulder. And I'm like, it's my mother. And she's like, I'm like, Mom, you can't take this picture with me and Stuart McLean. Like, I won the award. It has to be just him and me. And she's like, well, you can't either, because if a picture with you and a white man gets out, then I will never be able to marry you off to anyone, because people will think you've had an affair with him. And she made me move, you guys. She actually made me move out of the picture. They had to put somebody else between us. And so that was maybe the second most humiliating part of my life. But this is the type of family I came from. 20 years later, Stuart McLean, that same instructor, he became famous, and he was going across the country doing radio broadcasts. And he came to Saskatchewan, where I live. And I actually went into the green room, and I had a picture taken with him. And then I sent it to my mom. I think I have it here. And I said, look, Mom. That's him, you guys. That's him. I have a selfie. So I took that and I sent it to my mother, who, by the way, did not care, because she's like, you're married now. That's your husband's problem, right? Who you have an affair with, he can take care of him. So anyway, it was once I got into journalism. So he was my instructor. He was the most famous radio broadcaster in Canada. His name is Stuart McLean. And so he worked for Peter Zosky. So I was working for these men who were incredible, who were famous in Canada. And when I realized at that time, I had won an internship in his class. And that's when I realized that maybe journalism wasn't what I wanted to do, because I would interview all these famous people, and then I would come up with questions. Then I would hand it to Peter Zosky, and he would do these incredible interviews on air. And I was realizing he was having all the fun, and I was just sitting there like a little drone, coming up with these questions. So I asked someone, I said, what do you do when you think you've made the wrong choice and you want to do something more creative with your life? And they're like, well, then you should go to film school. And I was like, no, I can't. I can't now go to film school, right, after doing 2 degrees. And they said, well, then just take a 3-week summer workshop at the Ontario College of Art. It's just 3 weeks of your time. You'll just make a 5-minute short film, and that in that time period, you'll discover if you want to go into filmmaking. So I took it. It was 1995, and I had to. And we were put in groups of 5. So each one of us would become a crew member of the person who was writing and directing the film. So I was thinking, what would my 5-minute film be about? And that was when the Oklahoma bombing happened. Do you guys remember that in 1995? So in Canada, I remember it was the Toronto Star, and they had like a whole row of Muslim suspects, like 10 of them, right, as all the suspects for the Oklahoma bombing. And then 2 days later, Timothy McVeigh is arrested. And so it turns out to be a white supremacist. He was very angry at the government for their mishandling of the David Koresh case a few years earlier. So he had a truck bomb filled with explosives go into the Alfred Free Murray building and blew it up and killed 165 people, including children, right? So it was the biggest domestic act of terror in the United States. And it was so interesting to me that it just took 2 days for them to find a white guy, right? And I thought, this is interesting, the whole stereotypes of Muslims and terrorism. This was like in 1995. And so I thought, I'm going to make a commentary on this. So I wrote a film called Barbecue Muslims. And in this film, I had 2 Muslim brothers who were sleeping one night, and their barbecue blows up. And they're arrested for being Middle Eastern terrorists. And they're like telling the police, we've never actually even been to the Middle East. We grew up in the suburbs of Oakville. And the real terrorists are these 3 men who belong to the Barbecue Anti-Resistant Front. And they're against carbon pollution, right? Against coal burning and carbon pollution because of, this is ahead of its time, climate warming. And they decided they want to do something really, really extreme to get attention to their cause. We're going to have to just move that chair do you want to move that chair?
More babies. This is a record for the number of babies that have been in here.
Oh my goodness.
I'm hoping my droning will put the babies to sleep. So in this film, I'll show you, I think I have a picture of so in this film, so that's the group. They're death to air polluters. Charcoal barbecues are poisoning our air. And this is my brother and so these are the neighborhoods. So I actually recruited my brother and all the neighbors that lived around my parents, and they're staring at this big hole in the ground. And so at the very bottom are the 2 those pictures of the Muslim terrorists that are circulating that we got to find these two, and they arrest my brother and his friend. So this was a comedy. And so the brothers are like, you're arresting the wrong people, and the right guys are trying to get attention for their cause, and they're arguing with each other. They're like, why, of all the barbecues in suburban backyards, why did you pick the one that's owned by Muslims? And the other guy's like, they're not labeled according to faith. They're just there randomly, dispersed throughout backyard suburbia. We don't know which one is owned by what faith group. So I just blew one of them up, and lo and behold, it was the wrong one, and now it's causing them no end of trouble. So that was the first film. I of course thought it was worth an Oscar, so I submitted it to the Toronto International Film Festival. And a few months later, I got a very irate call from the Toronto International Film Festival, and they said, listen, we are actually going to program your film, but there are going to be very angry and upset filmmakers who are going to be displaced because of your film, because there are technically perfect films out there that are being made by students, and then there's you, right? Without real actors, without real crew. Like, it was really badly made, right? But he goes, we cannot dismiss the fact that you are the only one out there making satirical comedy about Muslims and terrorism, because it was like 1995, and just based on that originality, we're forced to show this film. So I mean, just by the fact that it was, I didn't even know it was a comedy, you guys. I just thought I was making a very serious piece about about terrorism and Muslims and stereotypes. But I think the actors realized what I was doing, and they were ad-libbing. So it became like this hysterical parody, right? Badly done hysterical parody. But it showed at the Toronto International Film Festival, and people were laughing. And that's when I realized, I said, I think I really enjoy making comedies and making comedies that have something to say about what's going on in the world, and getting people to acknowledge sort of the double standards and the hypocrisy that happens by making them laugh. Because by making people laugh, then they're willing to discuss the issues. So then I thought, okay, for my next film, what should I do? And that was the year that when I talk to young audiences, I never know if they know the people I'm talking about. He used to be really famous. His name is Salman Rushdie. Do you guys know him? There's some people who are like, no. It gets scary. There are people who don't know who I'm talking about anymore. Yeah, so now I have to tell people, I go, so he was this man who wrote this book and then got a fatwa of death from the Ayatollah in Iran. And so it caused a huge kerfuffle in the literary world. And so there was all this debate about Muslims, and they couldn't handle free press and fatwas of death. And I thought to myself, it would be hilarious to make a comedy about this obsession with Muslims and fatwas and free speech. And so I wrote a film called Death Threat. And it was about a Muslim woman who writes a really schlocky novel, like really, really, really bad novel. And she can't get it published anywhere. So she decides to get a death threat on purpose. That she go to her Muslim community and upset them until someone finally says, that's it, we've had it, sentence her to death. So she goes out and she vandalizes the mosque, and she's doing all these things. And then the mosque community is like, can we help you? Can we get you a psychiatrist? Like, you seem disturbed. What's wrong? You seem really upset. How can we make you feel better? And she's realizing the community is not helping her out. So she decides she needs some real terrorists to sign her, and she's written her own death threat out, right? So she realizes there's the Hamas are in town, all male meeting of the Hamas, no women invited, at the local university. So she decides to wear her niqab and go to the university with her death threat and get them to sign it. And so she gets there to the all-male class, and she realizes she had misread the sign, and it wasn't an all-male class for Hamas. It was an all-male cooking class for hummus, right? And so she's like, oh my God, I've screwed up again. But then she dismisses the chickpea delivery guy and pretends she's delivering the chickpeas, and gets the instructor who was teaching an all-male class because they are too embarrassed to learn to cook in front of women, and she gets him to sign it because he thinks he's signing for his chickpeas. And then she gets her death threat, right? And so this whole thing ensues. I think I have a tiny poster. This is not the greatest poster. So this was like the opening for death threat. So at this point, the National Film Board of Canada recognizes the stuff I'm doing, and they're like, you make all these cookie films. We would like you to do something more serious, like something more less comedy, more sort of something about your own Muslim community and the state of affairs in your own community. And it was then that I had moved from Toronto to Saskatchewan, and there was kind of this resurgence. I think a lot of people have these things happen in their mosque where there's sort of this resurgence of fundamentalism or conservatism, and we had an imam from Saudi Arabia who came, and because we prayed without barriers or curtains, we were in the same prayer hall, and so this imam was like, no, this is wrong. Women shouldn't be just seen like that, walking around in the mosque, praying like that in the open. So we should, we'll let the babies get a break. Poor things. I'm not Zootopia, you guys. I'm sorry. So the Saudi imam had told our congregation that he felt there was too much openness. The women were just praying openly. There were no curtains. There were no barriers. And he said this is wrong from an Islamic point of view. And so I knew from my readings of the Hadith that there were no curtains and there were no balconies. That the men prayed in the same prayer hall. If there was something that was said wrong by the khatib, the women would stand up and complain, and that there was this general sense of community in the mosque, and that these barriers and curtains were very cultural and from sort of misogyny and sexism, but not from Islam. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to make a documentary and talk about this. Let's get our community to talk about these things. Where is this coming from? And part of the inspiration had come from a documentary that Jewish feminists had made, Half My Kingdom, about barriers and balconies and Jewish synagogues, which I thought was amazing, because just when you think it's your own community, right, that can't get any kookier, trust me, somebody will be there in the back going, no, we do this too. This always happens at every talk I go to. I was once told I would make a great preacher in the Mennonite fundamentalist community by a Mennonite in Saskatchewan. And so I went across the country and I interviewed women and men and imams and talked about this issue of where this is coming from, the separation of men and women, and how it wasn't actually from Islam. It was more from the sort of a cultural expression from other places. Oh, wait. Sorry, because we're running out of time, I'm not going to talk about my 2 other kooky movies that I also made. I made 2 more, but I could go on and on about my kookiness. So this is actually the documentary that came out in 2005. And this is Tariq Swaydan. Have you heard of Tariq Swaydan? He's famous from Kuwait, famous scholar from Kuwait. Jack, have you ever heard of him? Tariq Swaydan? So I went to RIS, the Reviving the Islamic Spirit conference, the very first year they put it on, and they had all these guys from all over the Middle East, because we didn't have the budget to fly around, right? So I snuck into one of their side rooms, and as the men finished their lectures, I'd grab them and stick them, and I had a camera crew just like this, and stick them in a chair and interview them about the whole issue of women in mosques and the whole issue of barriers and curtains, and they all said it was wrong. All of them. They said, no, this did not exist during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Women were, were part of the community, were a vibrant part of our society, and this came centuries later. So I made this big documentary, and then the National Film Board asked me to travel to the Banff Television Festival where I would present it. And traditionally, the Banff Television Festival is the place where television shows are pitched to executive producers for people who don't live in Toronto, right? So that we have a chance to meet other people. And I thought, God, they're paying my way for 2 days. Like, what am I going to do, at the Banff Television Festival? And my friend goes, well, why don't you just make up a sitcom idea, just to pitch for the heck of it, so you're not wasting your time. I'm like, okay. My husband's famous last words, what do you know about making a TV show? So she gave me a template, and she goes, you got to figure out your log line, your main characters, their conflicts, how this works. And so this was in my mind at the time, right? I thought to myself, how would a mosque change if you had an imam who didn't come from, say, a culture that was obsessed with separating men and women as a normal part of their life? What if they were part of a culture that was really promoting gender equity, right? That was the principle of Islam. How would that change how a mosque would be run? So I came up with the idea that a young lawyer from Bay Street in Toronto has an epiphany, wants to become an imam, leaves his practice in Toronto, and the only job he can find is this tiny little broken down mosque in the middle of the prairies in Saskatchewan. And because they're so tiny, this community, they can't even afford a mosque. They have to actually rent space in the church, and because the church is losing so many congregants, they don't have enough money to pay their rent, so it's win-win for both groups. So I placed the mosque in the church, because growing up, I didn't go to purpose-built mosques. All the mosques I attended were converted churches, right? So pews and stained glass windows and all those little Warren-like rooms was what I associated with comfort and mosque and spirituality. So recreated that situation in this show. And so the show was about an imam. So he's in the middle. His name is Amar. So he goes to this tiny town, and these are all the people. So you've got on the far right, you've got Babar, who's sort of my nemesis in real life in the mosque, hardcore, tough on the women, very fundamentalist. But he's a single father of Layla, his daughter. And so she's the one who doesn't want to wear hijab, who smooths over his rough edges. And then beside Layla is Ryan, who is the young doctor in town, the woman who actually made it to medical school, right? That I could live vicariously through. That's her father, Yasser, who's Lebanese, who likes religion only if it because he runs a construction business. So if it works out for he got a free room in the mosque because he got the mosque for the Muslims. So now he doesn't have to pay rent. So he uses religion to his advantage if it works for him. So he's kind of secular. He's married to Sarah, the convert. And that's Amar. Then there's Father McGee, who runs the church, and he's dealing with the conflict of now having a Muslim congregation and a Christian congregation. Then there's the mayor, Popovitz, who's sort of having to be the mayor of this town. The right-wing radio shock jock, Fred Tupper, who was based in the right-wing radio shock jock in Regina, where I live. And then Fatima, who's Nigerian, who runs the cafe, who's also a single mom. So this was my group. These are my actors. And so this is the show that we made. And so this is like being about to be broadcast on CBC television, right? And so CBC television in Canada is like PBS, right? It's like publicly funded, publicly run, not known for the biggest hits in the country, right? But strangely enough, in Canada, because the Americans got wind of this show, right? And this is after, so we're close to 2006, and the Danish cartoon controversy happened in 2005. So everyone's like, oh my God, the Canadians are insane. They're making a comedy about Muslim, not even like a Cosby-like comedy with a living room and a couch and family. They're doing a comedy about Islam in a mosque, setting, religion, all these things together. They're like insane. Muslims are going to, blow up buildings and flip cars, and Toronto is going to go up in fire. So next thing we know, we're getting New York Times and CNN and everyone descending on us, interviewing us, which is really strange for a little Canadian comedy, right? Because we've never, we hardly make comedies. And we much less don't get any attention from the Americans. And thus our comedies don't survive because we can't, all our eyeballs usually go to the American shows, and that we don't have enough people to sustain, because we're only 30 million people. We don't have a good, a base of television shows in Canada. We've never had it, right? So until this show comes, right? Until this show comes, nobody's ever watched Canadian shows other than like maybe King of Kensington, right? King of Kensington or the Beachcombers. You have to be Canadian to understand those references. So we suddenly have millions and millions of unpaid ad dollars for the first time in Canadian history, because the Americans are so worried that Canada is going to blow itself up, that we get record ratings that CBC hasn't had in like 20 years. And so every year everyone's like, should we cut funding for the CBC? They never have any hits. Nobody really watches that show. Is it really relevant? So all those voices just died, right? Because they made like the hottest show, Canadian television, with the highest ratings. People from all over the world were clamoring to see what Canada was up to. I mean, even I was scared. I was like, did I do something wrong? Right? Because by the time it's already in the can and being about to air, that people are freaking out. And I'm like, maybe, am I going to get killed? I don't know. Right? So what do I do? Because in my mind, I'm not making really anything controversial. I mean, if anyone's ever seen Little Mosque, I mean, it's like as gentle as, I don't know, like what would you call, like very, touched by an angel or something like that, right? That's like essentially it's pardon me?
Little House on the Prairie?
Like Little House on the
Oh, Little House. Yeah, it was like Little House on the Prairie, right? It's not cutting edge, right? But what made it cutting edge was it was a comedy, and nobody would ever think that Muslims could do that and get away with it. So we had enough ratings that we were able to keep the show going for 6 years with 91 episodes. And what was interesting to me was that it started being exported to Europe, and the Europeans started like descending on my home. Like I would get camera crews from Sweden going, we don't understand this. What this show is confusing to us. And I was like, why? And they're like, Muslims and Christians living together in harmony. Muslims are educated and they're integrated. And that was when it dawned on me that even though I had made this television show and my whole emphasis has been gender equity in mosques, and I was really mad at the guys for the curtains, and that was why what had originated the show. What the Europeans were seeing was something completely different. They were seeing multiculturalism. They were seeing cultural acceptance. They were seeing cultural flexibility, and they couldn't understand it, right? And that was when I started learning that the way Americans and Canadians had treated their minority immigrant populations was radically different than how the Europeans had integrated or not integrated their communities, right? And that Turkish immigrants had been brought into Germany to rebuild Germany after World War II, yet had been put in ghettos, never given citizenship, treated like temporary foreign workers, except that they stayed there for generations. Their children never getting access to citizenship, so they couldn't go to university. So essentially, you were creating an indentured poverty class that could never raise itself up and become part of the German people, and that there were all these discriminatory laws, like you couldn't wear hijab to go to school, or even if you took off your hijab and wore a maxi skirt, you would still be removed because somehow modesty was a Muslim principle, and that that was to be eliminated, and so there were all these discriminatory laws and ghettoizations of the Muslim community in Europe, so that they were unable really to fit in or feel like they belonged or had anything invested into their civil societies. Whereas it was so different for me growing up in Canada. When I decided to wear hijab, the teachers were like, well, that's weird because it was the 1980s, but whatever, and that we had policies set in place for reasonable accommodations, at least in Canada. I'm sure it exists in different terms in the U.S., and what that had allowed was minority populations to feel like they had a stake in the societies that they belonged to, and that we no longer felt like we belonged to our countries back home. And it was so interesting because this book that I've written, Laughing All the Way to the Mosque, it came out in France a year ago, and I was talking with my French editor, and she's like, you keep calling yourself Canadian, like you're a Canadian. Why do you do that? And I'm like, because I am. And she's like, no, but we've had Muslims who've been in our country for generations who still say I'm Moroccan or I'm Tunisian or I'm Algerian. They never say I'm French, right? And that was when it started dawning on me that I no longer have a Pakistani identity. Like when my father asked me to get my Pakistani passport because they now allow for dual citizenship, and I was like, hell no. No, I'm good with my Canadian citizenship. And we as children, as immigrants, we have sort of absorbed this sense of national identity, that who we are and where we belong and what our future, is going to be, and that we are part of the civil engagement of the societies we belong to. But that has been a result of the way we have been treated and accepted and being allowed to be part of society. That's almost, that it's come down into our psyches, whereas that hasn't happened in Europe. And so strangely enough, this show was actually exporting that sense of identity and that sense of mutual accommodation to Europe, and they were really confused by that, right? Really, really confused because they didn't understand how we did it. Like, how do you do that? Because they don't have a system of multiculturalism the way we do. It doesn't exist. It's very, very fractured in that part of the world, and they're still grappling with it. And we've seen it, the most radical case with the burkini wars, right? They're going to go to the mat for the burkini, and these are women who are trying to integrate and fit in to society by trying to meet halfway. And when you don't even allow that, then you create a population that's very damaged and just feels like they don't have a place in society. So those were the things that I had, from my journey from being a daughter of immigrant parents to making this television show. It was this incredible learning curve of what we have in our societies and what makes our society so healthy and so diverse and so accepting, and what the repercussions can be for future generations. And I know that you guys are going through one of the most difficult election years ever, probably, with Trump and Clinton. And whenever people look at me and say, oh, you're so lucky you have Justin Trudeau. And what I want to remind Americans is that you guys probably don't know, but we had Stephen Harper for 8 years. And that is probably the most Canadian version of Trump you will ever find in terms of being polite and, accepting of xenophobia and racism that you will ever have, because he became extremely divisive in his final years. He became extremely arrogant because he felt that there was no way that old stock Canadians, as he put it, would ever deny him the majority that they had given him for 2 years. But he became so arrogant that he started fighting really silly little wars, like the Burkini War. For him, it was the niqab. There was a Muslim woman who wanted to become a Canadian citizen, and in the Canadianship ceremonies, you have to sing the national anthem, right? So, and she was willing to take her niqab off for the identification purposes, but all she wanted to do was sing the national anthem with her niqab on, because they would be in a mixed audience. And he said no. He goes, she would not be allowed to do that unless she took it off. But what he didn't anticipate was that she would actually go to the media and speak, right, on her behalf and her right to be able to wear it, and that she was a university educated woman. She knew her Islam. She knew the different opinions. She decided as a woman to make her own independent choice. How dare the Prime Minister of Canada tell her as a woman what to do? And so the two of them were having battles in the media, and that's when people started opening their eyes and saying, this isn't about the niqab. This is about a vision, of superiority of one culture over another and intolerance of another group of people. He went against First Nations in Canada. And, he started passing laws to make it more difficult for them to be able to vote. He passed the cultural barbaric hotline, so you could call, if you felt something horrific was happening, which it wasn't necessary because we already have the criminal code in place. And so gradually, I think what was happening in Canada was like we had to make a decision about who we were as a country and what our national identity was, that as a Canadian value, we believed in tolerance and acceptance, and we had cultural accommodation and flexibility. And this man was trying to take that back from us. And I believe that's ultimately what resulted in his defeat in Canada, was Canadians saying that this was becoming too much and that this was becoming too obvious what he was trying to do. And that, because Justin Trudeau for a long time was not expected to win in the polls. He was, he had no experience really in politics. And so this was a huge upset for the Conservative Party. But I think what the country said was, yeah, we don't know if he's been tested, but we'd rather have this untested guy than ultimately the vision of what you want Canada to become. And so when I come here, on the speaking tour, and I speak to audiences, American audiences, and they look really scared and they're worried about the election, I can only tell you that we were in the same place you guys were. And that I believe that as Americans, you guys will make the right choice, because I think ultimately Americans know what makes America great, and it's the diversity of its cultures and its faiths and its people and its immigrants, and that ultimately that will prevail in the end. So I believe in all of you. So don't worry. Everything will be okay in November. And on that note, how much time? I can drone on and on forever.
We've about half an hour or 25 minutes left. Do you have a lot more, or do you want to take questions? Or
I can take questions, because I can talk and talk and talk and put you guys in.
Do you have any